All right, the women's liberation movement, the final movement we'll talk about in this unit of civil rights movements. So this one we will do a little bit of background, but we're going to focus between the 50s and right about the current day. So background to this, the Seneca Falls Convention will officially kick off the women's rights movement in 1848. At that Seneca Falls Convention will be the first time, we'll say the first big mass meeting of women asserting their equality in society. They issue the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, which basically asserts that they're equal to men. Women will participate in the abolition movement throughout the Civil War. And the women's suffrage movement will eventually culminate with the 19th Amendment in 1919, the women's right to vote. So that'll be a 70-year fight to earn the right to vote for women. Women will join the industrial workforce in new ways during World War II. Not all of them wanted to accept their diminished roles at home, and they valued their new freedoms. And the happy housewife stereotype in the 50s, which we did an activity on for regular U.S. As part of our first COVID week unit. So there's our background. Seneca Falls Convention, obviously in 1848 we didn't have cameras, so we just have a drawing. Not the abolition movement, the suffrage movement. Okay, women protesting for their right to vote. A lot of women got 7 months in jail. A lot of women got force-fed. A lot of women got beaten for just saying, hey, we should be able to vote too. World War II, women entering the industrial workforce, experiencing new freedoms, both socially, economically, educationally. We start to see some doors going down or some walls going down at this point. So, major events in the women's liberation movement included what? A, Seneca Falls Convention. B, the abolition movement. C, the suffrage movement. D, the entering of the industrial workforce. Or E, all of the above. All right, so can't talk about women's liberation or women's rights movement without talking about reproductive rights, which tends to be a bit controversial. So we'll try to speak or stay pretty narrow as we talk about this. So, Margaret Sanger will found the American Birth Control League in 1923, which eventually becomes Planned Parenthood. It was shut down repeatedly by the police because in the 1920s, talking about birth control was considered obscene. Right? It was not protected speech anymore. It was obscene speech. So she will get arrested multiple times. She will have her place, like her actual physical location of work where the Birth Control League will be raided multiple times. Birth control information will finally be declared to be not obscene in 1936. So you couldn't legally talk about birth control, right? Whether or not it's any form of birth control, you just couldn't talk about birth control until 1936 in a public manner. More legal fights will follow in order to publicize information on birth control. Prior to this, in the late 1920s, a group of women from England will sail over here to talk about birth control with women here from America, and they will be booted out of America. They'll be deported, they'll be banned, basically, for talking about that because we still considered it obscene. The birth control is eventually developed and will be approved by the FDA in the year 1960. Okay? Much more controversial than that will be abortion rights. In the year 1973, a Supreme Court case was finalized called Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion in the United States. Before we go any further, I know this is a very controversial thing, right? Still very much to this day, but just the straight up facts about the case. Okay, what Roe v. Wade says is that abortion is 100% legal in the United States during the first trimester. During the second trimester, it is still mostly legal, but not 100% legal. There are more barriers put in place. And in the third trimester, so the last 3 months of pregnancy, it is mostly illegal in the United States, except for under very certain situations, right? Like if the baby was product of incest or rape in some states, or if the life of the mother is in jeopardy. So Roe versus Wade itself was mostly a compromise based on medical opinions formed by the Supreme Court. That doesn't stop it from being very controversial for the most part. Conservative people are pro-life, meaning that they don't want there to be abortion, and more liberal people are pro-choice, meaning that they believe that women should have the choice of whether or not they have to carry a baby because it is their body. So those are the two sides fighting over it, right? It's still controversial to this day. At this point, every presidential candidate has to answer the question whether they support Roe versus Wade or are pro-choice or pro-life. Every Supreme Court justice has to answer that question. It's been a very long-range goal of the religious right to get enough justices on the Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade. States have some leeway in how they allow or don't allow abortion. They can't outlaw it, but they can make it harder to come by or whatever, put other restrictions in place. That's constitutionally okay. That's happening throughout the country. So very hot button, very controversial, right? You can make up your own mind about it if you'd like. I'm not here to tell you how to think. I'm just here to tell you what's actually happened. So there's Margaret Sanger. Eventually, her group becomes Planned Parenthood. Planned Parenthood, very controversial because of some of its clinics doing abortion procedures. The vast majority of things done at Planned Parenthood will be medical care for poor women, for the most part, STD checks, general women's healthcare things like their yearly physical type things that they have to go through, but also some abortion proceedings, which makes it controversial. So, Margaret Sanger founded the American Birth Control League in blank, and birth control was finally approved by the FDA in blank. So there's going to be two correct answers. They're both dates. We got 1923, 1930, 1960, and 1973. So Roe versus Wade, still controversial. We got people on both sides there protesting. The day Roe versus Wade was announced was also the day that LBJ died, so kind of a pretty momentous day, right? But with abortion and those sorts of things, what's important to note, okay, here right now in America, we're at one of our lowest points in abortions in the country, and part of that is the availability of birth control methods. The state of Colorado kind of pioneered that, where it made birth control very easy to come by, and abortion rates in our state have dropped significantly. Nobody's super pro the actual act of abortion. What it comes down to is the argument about whether or not women should control when and if they have to have a child. So still super controversial, like I said. Look it up, look at a variety of sources, and make up your own conclusions on this. But it's something you'll hear about a lot. It's going to be in the news a lot forever, right? So, Roe versus Wade legalized blank in America in 1973. Was it A, abortion, B, birth control, C, women's suffrage, or D, equal pay? All right, next thing, the Commission on the Status of Women will be created by the JFK administration in 1961. They put Eleanor Roosevelt in charge. Remember, Eleanor was the first super prominent and important first lady that went out and did things, right? Was a civil rights advocate. She'll be put in charge of this, and what they were going to do was study and highlight the inequalities that women faced in America in education, employment, childcare, and government opportunities, and then propose some solutions. So here is Eleanor on the left there with JFK, and on the right there's the whole committee meeting and shaking hands and doing all that stuff. They will find a whole lot of inequalities, and they will propose a lot of solutions, some of which will get adopted, some of which will get ignored. So the Commission on the Status of Women investigated inequalities that women faced in which four of these? A, education, B, employment, C, dress, D, childcare, E, social freedoms, or F, government opportunities. All right, part of what comes out of this commission will be the Equal Pay Act. Women's employment options were limited, and by 1960, about half of all women had jobs. But those women made about 63 cents for every dollar a man made. So say it was me, a male teacher, and a female teacher, the same qualifications. I would get paid $1 an hour, and a woman would get paid 63 cents an hour. So Congress will pass the Equal Pay Act in 1963. The goal there was to equalize the pay gap, right? So make it illegal for employers to pay a woman less than what a man would receive for the same job with the same qualifications. Has been pretty successful. The wealth gap has shrunk from 37 cents an hour to more like 10 cents an hour. But there's still a pay gap, right? It's much smaller, but it is still around. There have been other laws passed to add on to this Equal Pay Act, including the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which was passed under the Obama administration, but still something that's going on. The areas where I have the most issue, I believe I just read, was in medicine, in medicine with doctors. So, anyways, the Equal Pay Act passed in 1963 made it illegal to pay a woman less than what a man would receive for the same job. It has narrowed but not closed the gender pay gap. Is that true or is that false? All right, Title VII in the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So part of the Civil Rights Act was Title VII, right? And Title VII outlaws discrimination on the basis of gender. Title VII will give feminist groups legal standing to challenge discrimination in laws, which means it becomes a very valuable tool. So if you're going to do test cases, if you're going to take things to the Supreme Court, like we've seen in all these other movements, you need some legal standing. And Title VII gave women's liberation groups legal standing to challenge discrimination in court. Betty Friedan will be an activist, one of the ones we'll highlight here. She's an important author and activist. She will write The Feminine Mystique in 1963, which criticized the plight of women with domestic duties while also working full-time for less money. So it kind of gave voice to a lot of the unhappiness that a lot of women felt being kind of forced to stay at home instead of living the lives that they kind of come accustomed to during the war period. She'll help form the National Organization for Women in 1966 with other feminist groups. Now will call for equal employment and pay, argued for changes in divorce laws to be made more fair for women, and sought the legalization of abortion. So they'll be successful in some of their aims, but not in all of them. Focusing in there on that middle part, argued for changing in divorce laws. In some states at this point, women couldn't file for divorce, men had to do it. A lot of states, men always got the control of the children afterwards. Marital abuse wasn't really a thing. You were allowed to beat your wife, you were allowed to rape your wife until the 1970s. So there was a lot of ground to be fixed in that area. So there's Betty Friedan, there's her book, The Feminine Mystique. So there's now the National Organization for Women talking for equality. And now is the time, is what they're saying. All right, so what does NOW stand for? A, the National Organization for Wildlife. B, the National Organization for Women. C, the National Organization for the World. Or D, none of the above. All right, the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. Equal Rights Amendment, another controversial part of this movement. So, it called for extending the guarantees of the 14th Amendment for racial and religious minorities to women. So when we passed the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, it said that the benefits of citizenship, the rights of citizenship, cannot be abridged, cannot be harmed or shortened or cut because or on account of your racial, ethnic, or religious standing, right? Because you're black or brown or Catholic or Muslim or whatever. You can't have your rights hurt or cut or restricted in any way. The Equal Rights Amendment really was just going to have that amendment written, except instead of saying on account of your religion or racial makeup, it'll say no one's rights under the Constitution can be restricted on account of sex, right? So that was the ERA, literally was that. And I'll show you a picture here that has the entire amendment written down, which is very short. It passed Congress in 1972, which then means it goes to the states. And 38 out of the 50 states had to ratify it, and it does not ratify. Okay, it does not ratify because middle-class and pro-life people will rally against it, fearing that the Equal Rights Amendment would deny them rights to financial support from divorce or would end special treatment they had received in a male-dominated society. So those arguments will be persuasive enough to convince enough states to not ratify it. So literally, here's the amendment they wanted to pass that was controversial. Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. That's literally all it's saying, is that women should have equal rights. So, on the right, there's the map of the states that did not pass it. Colorado, our state, did. Recently, Virginia and Illinois did pass it. And there's questions about whether or not the ERA is actually dead. It was given a time frame of when it had to be passed by the states. And it's past that time frame. There's questions about whether or not that time frame is constitutional. So I don't think we've heard the end of the ERA, but for now, the ERA did not pass. And I just said that, so screw this question, moving on. All right, Miss Magazine will be the most popular magazine, the major forum for feminist voices during this part of the women's liberation movement. First published as a sample out of New York Magazine, and it sold 300,000 copies in 8 days, so it started publishing its own. Editor was Gloria Steinem, who is still an icon of the modern feminist movement. I don't think Miss Magazine's still in publication, but Steinem and a lot of the people who came through that magazine still publish and write books and do all sorts of activist activities. But here's the first edition of it right there on the right. On the left, there is Gloria Steinem, still active in politics and activism to this day. All right, so gains. Here coming up on the end of this lecture. Concrete things that were gained by the women's liberation movement. So, 1972, federal government requires that colleges create affirmative action programs for women. The group of people who gained the most out of affirmative action in terms of education and career opportunities were women, particularly white women, because we weren't allowing a lot of women into colleges in this time period. Roe versus Wade will legalize abortion in 73. That was a goal of the women's liberation movement, to have their choice of whether or not they have children. Several corporations were forced to pay back wages to female employees who had not received equal pay after the Equal Pay Act was passed. Hiring practices that discriminated against women had to be reformed or abolished under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. More inclusion in the military. Now, at this point, women weren't serving active duty, weren't firing guns in combat, but now they are, and this was a stepping stone towards that. Title IX will guarantee equal access for girls to programs that boys benefit from. Example there will be college sports, and we'll talk about this here a little bit more in depth. So Title IX says this: no person in the United States shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any educational program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So any school in the country that receives money from the federal government, which is every public school and every public college, cannot discriminate based on sex, which means that they have to spend a nearly equal amount of money on programs for girls that they spend on programs for guys. So in college, let's do the college sports, right? So if you're going to offer 100 scholarships to men's athletes, you have to offer 100 scholarships to female athletes, right? That's how they equalize it, right? And because of Title IX, has led to America being by far the world's dominant power in female athletics. Right, here's a couple examples. On the left, our women's national soccer team has won almost every gold medal, almost every Women's World Cup, and almost every Women's Olympics gold medal. Our women's national basketball team has never lost in international competition. They annihilate everybody. The only times that they lose is when they play other American teams. And if people are injured, just this year they were doing work because the Olympics hadn't been canceled yet or postponed yet. They lost to the University of Oregon. Right, but they don't lose in international competition. So through Title IX, and I'm using sports as a context here because I'm a coach, but education's the same way. If you're going to fund a bunch of projects for guys to go out and learn something, you got to fund a project for girls to go out and learn something similar. So Title IX requires that there be equal access for girls to programs that boys benefit from. That has helped lead to the U.S. to dominate in female what? A, sports, B, literature, C, scouting, or D, all of these. All right, and that's the end of the Women's Liberation Movement lecture and the end of all the lectures for the Civil Rights Movement.